There are places in this world that don't want to be found. Places where the air feels heavier, where silence has a texture, and where your instincts scream at you to turn back before you've even crossed the threshold. I learned that lesson in an abandoned riverside cemetery on the edge of town, in the fading light of a late October evening. My name is irrelevant now. What matters is what I saw there, what chased us through those crooked headstones, and the question that still wakes me up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat. Why did they let us leave? My friend Jake and I ran a YouTube channel about abandoned places and local urban legends. Nothing huge, just about 15,000 subscribers who appreciated our genuine approach to exploring forgotten corners of our city. We took it seriously, researched our locations, respected the history, and tried to tell the stories that deserve to be remembered. Halloween was our biggest content season, and we were always searching for something special, something our audience hadn't seen a dozen times before on other channels. That's when Jake found the post. It was buried in a local history forum, written by someone who claimed their grandfather had worked as a groundskeeper there in the 1980s. The cemetery sat past a stretch of dense woods on the eastern edge of town, fenced off and abandoned since the early 1990s. Most of the gates were chained shut, and the local kids had long since moved on to other places for their weekend adventures. But the rumors persisted. Whispers about illegal burials that were quietly closed, about sections of the cemetery that didn't appear on any official map, about sounds that echoed through the trees on certain nights. We couldn't verify any of it, but that was part of the appeal. Mystery drove our channel. The unknown was what our subscribers craved. So we packed our equipment, charged our batteries, and decided to go on a Saturday afternoon in late October, timing our arrival for just before sunset. We wanted that golden hour footage, that perfect light that made everything look both beautiful and slightly unsettling. We had no idea what we were actually walking into. We had no idea that some mysteries are mysteries for a reason, and that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The fence looked worse than we expected. Rust had eaten through most of the chain link and patches, and someone probably teenagers years ago had torn open a section wide enough to walk through without even ducking. Jake slipped through first, camera already rolling, his voice dropping into that practiced narrator tone he used for our videos. I followed with the backpack full of extra batteries, a flashlight, and the backup microphone we rarely needed, but always brought. At first, everything felt exactly like we'd hoped. The cemetery stretched out before us in that perfectly melancholic way that made for great footage. Crooked headstones leaned at odd angles, their inscriptions worn smooth by decades of rain and wind. Collapsed mausoleums stood like broken teeth against the tree line, their iron gates rusted open or missing entirely. Overgrown paths wound between graves, barely visible beneath layers of dead leaves and wild grass. Toppled crosses lay scattered like forgotten promises. It was beautiful in that haunting way that abandoned places always are, full of stories and silence and the weight of time. Jake moved through it all with practiced ease, filming sweeping shots of the landscape, close-ups of particularly weathered headstones, and those atmospheric sequences our audience loved. His commentary flowed naturally as he talked about the cemetery's history, the families buried here, the slow decline that led to its abandonment. I walked beside him, keeping an eye on the equipment, occasionally pointing out interesting details he might have missed. We'd done this enough times that we moved almost automatically, a well-practiced rhythm developed over dozens of locations. The sun dropped faster than we anticipated once we moved deeper into the cemetery. The trees grew denser here, their branches creating a canopy that swallowed the remaining light. Shadows stretched long and dark between the graves. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. And that's when I started noticing the things that didn't fit the narrative of an abandoned, forgotten place. Fresh boot prints marked the dirt between graves. Not just one set, but multiple different treads, all of them recent enough that the edges were still crisp and defined. They converged near the older section where the graves were packed closer together, where the headstones dated back to the 1800s. Then I saw the camping lantern hanging from a low tree branch, its metal casing catching the fading light. I reached out and touched it without thinking. The metal was still warm. Someone had been using it within the last hour, maybe less. My stomach tightened. I called out to Jake, who was about 20 feet ahead, framing a shot of a particularly ornate mausoleum. He lowered his camera and walked back, his expression shifting from creative focus to concern as I pointed out the lantern, the boot prints, the unmistakable signs of recent human presence. He checked his watch. 20 minutes of good light left, he said. We could push a little further, get some shots of the older section, and then wrap up. His enthusiasm hadn't quite been dampened by what we'd found. If anything, it had added an extra element of mystery to our exploration. I should have insisted we leave right then. I should have trusted the cold feeling spreading through my chest. But I didn't. Jake's eyes lit up the moment he heard the sound. This was exactly the kind of atmospheric element that made for compelling content, the unexpected detail that transformed a simple exploration video into something memorable. He raised his camera instantly, whispering his observations into the microphone about the mysterious noise echoing through the abandoned cemetery, his voice taking on that dramatic edge that our audience loved. He was already moving toward the sound before I could stop him. I kept hissing at him to leave, my voice low and urgent, but he wasn't listening. He was in full content creator mode now, following the narrative thread wherever it led. The sound grew louder as we moved deeper, leading us toward a section of the cemetery I hadn't noticed before. The graves here were older, the headstones more elaborate, many of them cracked or toppled entirely. Thick brush had grown up around them, creating natural barriers that obscured sight lines and made the space feel increasingly claustrophobic. Then we emerged into a clearing near a collapsed crypt, and everything changed. Someone had cleared the brush, maybe 20 feet across, creating an almost perfect circle of open space. The work was recent. I could see where branches had been cut, where vegetation had been pulled away and piled at the edges. In the center of the clearing sat a stone bench positioned between two graves. The bench itself looked old, probably original to the cemetery, but it had been cleaned. Someone had scrubbed away years of moss and dirt, leaving the stone pale and exposed. From where we stood, partially concealed by the edge of the collapsed crypt, I couldn't tell if anyone was sitting on that bench. The angle was wrong, and the fading light created shadows that confused depth and distance. Jake moved ahead of me, trying to get a better view for his camera, while I stayed back, every instinct screaming that we needed to leave immediately. The metal scraping sound continued, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere near that bench. I didn't realize my foot was coming down on a dead branch until it snapped beneath my weight. The crack echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. Everything went silent. Even the normal background sounds of the cemetery, the wind through the trees, the distant bird calls, everything stopped. Then something let out a sharp, piercing screech that made my blood run cold. Jake flinched hard and stepped backward, nearly colliding with me. That's when I finally got a clear look past the trees and into the clearing. A man sat on the stone bench between the two graves. He wore a wolf mask, the kind you might see at a costume shop, but this one looked old and used. Gray fur matted and dirty, hanging in clumps around the edges. The eye holes were completely dark. I couldn't see his face at all, couldn't see if he was looking at us or away, couldn't read any human expression or intent. Perched on top of one of the headstones, right next to the bench, was a small monkey, a capuchin maybe, with dark fur and quick, jerky movements. It was the source of the screeching. The creature's chain rattled as it moved, secured to something I couldn't see. The man hadn't moved yet. One of his hands rested on the bench, fingers spread against the stone. As I watched, those fingers began to tap a slow, deliberate rhythm. That was the scraping sound we'd been hearing. Fingernails on stone, over and over, patient and methodical. Then the man turned his head toward us. Not quickly, not with any apparent urgency, just a slow, deliberate rotation that made my skin crawl. The dark eye holes of the wolf mask seemed to focus directly on where Jake and I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, none of us moved. The monkey had gone quiet. The only sound was that rhythmic tapping, fingers against stone, steady as a heartbeat. Panic hit me like ice water. My hand shot out and grabbed Jake's wrist hard enough that he dropped his camera hand. The equipment swung on its strap as I pulled him backward, away from the clearing, away from those lights that had turned us into targets. We didn't talk, didn't plan, just moved on pure instinct, cutting between the graves and trying to retrace our path back toward the entrance we'd used. But the cemetery looked different now. Shadows had deepened with the dying light, and every path looked identical. The headstones that had seemed charming and atmospheric an hour ago now formed a maze that deliberately confused our sense of direction. One of the lights stayed on us the entire time, tracking our movement no matter which direction we turned, which grave we dodged behind, which path we chose. Someone was following us, keeping pace, never falling behind, but never quite catching up either. The ground was treacherous. Roots emerged from the earth at ankle height, nearly invisible in the failing light. The dirt was uneven, packed hard in some places and soft in others, hiding holes and depressions that could turn an ankle or send you sprawling. I jumped over what looked like a sunken grave, the earth having collapsed inward over decades, and nearly went down when I landed on loose soil on the other side. My arms windmilled as I fought for balance. Behind us, I could hear people moving through the cemetery. Not running, not hurrying, just walking with steady purpose. Multiple sets of footsteps, branches snapping, the soft crush of dead leaves. They knew this place. They knew exactly where we were and where we were likely to go. Jake's voice cut through my racing thoughts, asking where the exit was. I told him the truth. I didn't know. Once we'd started running, every landmark had become meaningless, every reference point lost. My foot clipped the edge of an open grave, one of those old plots where the earth had simply given way, and I went down hard. My palms hit dirt and something sharp, probably broken stone. Pain shot through my wrists. Jake grabbed the back of my jacket and hauled me up, his grip strong and desperate. We kept moving. Branches slapped across my face and arms as we pushed through brush that grew between the graves, nature slowly reclaiming what humans had abandoned. Somewhere behind us, the monkey screeched again. The sound was closer than it should have been, closer than seemed possible if the creature was still chained to that headstone. The thought of it being loose, moving through the cemetery toward us, made something primal wake up in my hindbrain. I ran harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. Then salvation appeared in the form of chain link fence materializing out of the gloom ahead. We hit it at full speed and started climbing immediately. The metal rattled under our combined weight, the sound impossibly loud after trying to move quietly. At the top was barbed wire we hadn't noticed when we came in, probably because we'd used one of the torn sections. Now, in our panic and the darkness, we'd emerged at a different point. The wire caught my jeans and tore through denim and skin as I went over. I felt the sharp sting, felt warmth spread down my leg, but I didn't stop. Jake came over right behind me. We hit the ground on the other side and kept running, crashing through the woods toward where we hoped we'd find the road and Jake's car. We didn't talk on the walk back to Jake's car. Our breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the cold October air. My leg was bleeding, my jeans torn and sticky with blood. Jake's hands were shaking so badly he had trouble getting his keys out of his pocket. When we finally got inside the vehicle, he immediately checked his camera with trembling fingers. I watched his face as he scrolled through the footage, watched his expression change from hope to confusion to something darker. The recording had stopped right before we got to the clearing, right before we saw the man in the wolf mask and the monkey, right before the lights came on. Everything we'd captured was just standard exploration footage. Crooked headstones, atmospheric shots of decay, his standard commentary about local history. Nothing that explained what had just happened. Nothing that proved we'd seen what we'd seen. Jake sat there for a long moment, the camera in his lap, staring at the dark screen. Then, without explanation, he started deleting files. I watched him erase the entire visit, every shot he'd taken, every carefully framed sequence. When I asked him why, his answer was simple and immediate. It felt wrong to bring people to that place. He said whoever was in there clearly didn't want to be found, and we'd gotten lucky they let us walk out. The implication hung in the air between us. Lucky this time. I couldn't have agreed more. But agreement didn't stop the questions that circled through my mind during the drive back to his place. Who were those people? What were they doing in an abandoned cemetery? Why the wolf mask and the monkey? Why create that cleared space, clean that bench, and set up lights throughout the grounds? None of it made sense, but all of it felt deliberately designed, purposeful in ways I couldn't quite grasp. A few weeks later, once the immediate fear had faded enough that curiosity could creep back in, I looked up the cemetery online. I found an article from 2003 in the local newspaper archives. Police had investigated reports of unusual activity in the cemetery at night. Multiple residents in the area had called in complaints about lights, about strange sounds, about vehicles parked near the entrance at odd hours. The police checked it out, walked through the grounds, and found nothing. The article mentioned that several people had gone missing in that area over the years. Nothing definitive, just a higher-than-average disappearance rate for such a sparsely populated region. But the article was careful to note that no bodies had ever turned up in the cemetery itself. No evidence of foul play. No signs of criminal activity. Just people who vanished and were never found. And an abandoned cemetery that local law enforcement had searched and cleared. But I'd been there. I'd seen the cleared space, the cleaned bench, the man in the mask, and the coordinated lights. I'd felt the deliberate nature of how they'd herded us, controlled our movement, let us panic and run, but never actually caught us. That wasn't nothing. That was organization, planning, and purpose. Jake and I stopped making videos after that. Not immediately. We tried to keep the channel going, tried to recapture whatever spark had driven us to explore forgotten places. But every location felt tainted now. Every shadow held potential threat. Every unexpected sound made us jump. Our content became cautious and boring. Our subscribers noticed. 3 months later, we deleted the whole channel. When anyone asked, we said we'd lost interest, moved on to other hobbies, grown up. We never talked about the cemetery again. Not once. It sat between us like a wall, this shared experience we couldn't acknowledge, because acknowledging it meant accepting what we'd seen and what it might mean. The nightmares started about a month after we deleted the channel. Not every night, but often enough that I began to dread falling asleep. They always followed the same pattern. I'd be back in the cemetery, but alone this time, no Jake beside me. The sun would be setting, that same golden light filtering through the trees, and I'd be walking toward the clearing where we saw the man in the mask. But in the dreams, I wouldn't stop. I wouldn't freeze at the edge and then run. Instead, I'd keep walking forward, drawn by some compulsion I couldn't resist. The man would still be sitting on the bench, fingers still tapping that rhythmic pattern against the stone. The monkey would still be perched on the headstone, watching me with eyes that seemed too intelligent, too aware. And then I'd realize the cleared space wasn't empty. There were others sitting between the graves, all wearing masks. Animal masks, dozens of them. Each person sitting perfectly still except for that same finger-tapping rhythm. Wolves and bears and foxes and deer, all surrounding me in a circle, all watching through dark eye holes, all perfectly synchronized in their movements. I'd wake up gasping, my heart racing, my sheets soaked with sweat. The worst part was the feeling that lingered after waking, the sense that the dream was showing me something true, something I'd been too frightened to notice during our actual visit. That we'd only seen one man because we'd only looked in one direction, but that the cemetery had been full of them, watching from the shadows. About 2 months after our visit, I noticed something odd. Missing person reports from our county and the surrounding areas seemed to spike in late October and early November. It wasn't dramatic, just a few more than average, enough that I might not have noticed if I hadn't been looking. I started keeping a record, marking dates and locations on a map I kept hidden in my desk drawer. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Every year, around Halloween, the number of disappearances increased slightly. Most were eventually resolved, runaways, people who'd chosen to leave, misunderstandings. But a small percentage remained unsolved. And when I marked those locations on my map, they formed a rough circle around the cemetery, None closer than about 10 miles, none farther than 30. I showed Jake once. He looked at the map for maybe 10 seconds before closing the drawer and walking away. He told me to stop. Told me we'd gotten out and we should be grateful and we should leave it alone. He wasn't wrong. I knew he wasn't wrong. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop seeing the pattern, couldn't stop wondering what we'd stumbled into that October evening. Then I found the forum post. The same local history board where Jake had originally found the information about the cemetery. Someone new had posted, someone with a username I didn't recognize, asking if anyone had recent information about the abandoned Riverside Cemetery. They said they were planning to visit for a photography project and wanted to know if it was safe. I stared at that post for hours, my cursor hovering over the reply button. Part of me wanted to warn them, to tell them exactly what we'd experienced, to beg them not to go. But another part of me knew how it would sound. Crazy. Paranoid. Like someone who'd let their imagination run wild after a spooky experience in a graveyard at dusk. In the end, I typed out a simple response. The cemetery is on private property, and the owners don't appreciate trespassers. I'd find somewhere else for your project. It felt inadequate, but it was all I could offer without sounding insane. The post was deleted the next day. Not just the reply I'd written, but the entire original post, gone as if it had never existed. I checked my browser history to make sure I hadn't imagined it. The URL was there, but when I clicked it, I got an error message. Page not found. 6 months after our visit, I started seeing the wolf mask in public. Not the actual mask, just images that resembled it closely enough to make my stomach drop. A Halloween decoration in a store window. A costume worn by someone walking past on the street. A thumbnail image on a YouTube video about cryptids and urban legends. Each time, I'd stop and stare, my breath catching, my mind immediately transported back to that clearing, to those dark eye holes watching us. Rationally, I knew these were just coincidences. Wolf masks weren't uncommon. Halloween was a commercial holiday. People wore costumes. But rational thought didn't stop the cold sweat, didn't slow my racing heart, didn't quiet the voice in my head that whispered I was being reminded, being watched, being warned to stay silent. Jake moved away that spring. He got a job offer in another state and took it without hesitation. We met for coffee before he left, our first real conversation in months. He looked tired, older somehow, like the past 6 months had aged him in ways that went beyond calendar time. We talked about nothing important for about 20 minutes before he finally addressed the real reason we were there. He told me he'd been back to the cemetery. Not inside, just to the fence line. One night in January when he couldn't sleep and couldn't stop thinking about it. He'd sat in his car on the access road and watched the tree line for over an hour. He said he saw lights moving between the trees, heard sounds carrying through the winter air, and saw at least 3 vehicles parked at different points along the fence. Whatever was happening there was still happening. It hadn't stopped. It wasn't going to stop. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said he thought they'd marked us somehow, that they knew who we were and where we lived, and that leaving us alone was a choice they were making, not a gap in their awareness. He said the smartest thing we could do was forget everything we'd seen, never speak about it again, and hope that whatever deal we'd made by running away that night remained in effect. I wanted to argue, wanted to say he was being paranoid, that he was letting fear turn a frightening experience into a conspiracy. But I couldn't, because I'd felt the same thing, that sense of being watched, of existing under someone's awareness, of waiting for consequences that might never come or might arrive without warning. After Jake left, I tried to follow his advice. I threw away the map with the missing person markers. I stopped searching for news about the cemetery. I deleted my forum account and stopped reading about local history. I focused on work, on normal life, on pretending that October evening had been nothing more than an unfortunate encounter with some people who wanted privacy. It worked for almost a month. Then I got the message. It came through an email account I hadn't used in years, one I'd set up for the YouTube channel and forgotten to delete. The sender was anonymous, the subject line blank. The message contained only a photograph. It showed the clearing in the cemetery, the stone bench, the 2 graves. But this photo was taken from a different angle than where Jake and I had been standing. This photo was taken from inside the clearing, looking outward. And there, at the edge of the frame, barely visible in the shadows at the tree line, were two figures. I couldn't make out details, but I knew it was us. Knew it was from that exact moment when we'd stood frozen at the edge, when we'd first seen the man in the mask. They'd photographed us. While we were watching them, they were documenting us. And they'd waited 6 months to let us know. 2 years have passed since that October evening. Jake and I haven't spoken since his going-away coffee. I've moved once, changed jobs twice, and done everything I can to build a life that has nothing to do with urban exploration, YouTube channels, or abandoned places. Most days I succeed. Most days the cemetery feels like something that happened to someone else, a story I heard rather than experienced. But late October always brings it back. The changing leaves, the cooling air, the lengthening shadows. They all combine to trigger memories I've tried to bury. This past October was the worst. Maybe because it marked the 2-year anniversary. Maybe because I'd been sleeping poorly and my defenses were down. Maybe because some part of me knew I couldn't run forever. I found myself driving toward the cemetery without consciously deciding to go. It was a Saturday afternoon, unseasonably warm for late October. I told myself I was just going to drive past, just going to see if the fence was still there, if the place looked as ominous in daylight as it had in the failing dusk of memory. I parked on the access road about 100 yards from where Jake and I had parked 2 years earlier. The fence looked the same. The gaps were still there, although they might have been slightly larger. The woods beyond were thick with undergrowth that hadn't yet fully died back for winter. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, engine off, windows down, just listening. The sounds were normal. Birds. Wind through leaves. Distant traffic on the main road. Nothing unusual. Nothing threatening. But I couldn't make myself get out of the car, couldn't make myself walk to that fence and look through. Because I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I did, I'd see something I wasn't meant to see. And this time, there might not be a chance to run. As I sat there, another car pulled up. An older sedan, faded blue paint, a few dents in the side panels. A woman got out, maybe in her 60s, carrying a bouquet of flowers wrapped in plastic from a grocery store. She walked past my car without acknowledging me, heading straight for the fence. I should have driven away. Every instinct told me to start the engine and leave before I witnessed something I'd regret. But I couldn't move. I watched as she approached one of the gaps in the fence, slipped through with practiced ease that spoke of repeated visits, and disappeared into the woods. She was gone for maybe 15 minutes. When she emerged, she no longer carried the flowers. Her face was composed, peaceful, showing no signs of fear or distress. She walked back to her car, got in, and drove away without once looking in my direction. The implications raced through my mind. She knew about this place. She visited regularly. She brought flowers to graves in an abandoned cemetery that supposedly no one cared about anymore. And she'd shown no fear, no hesitation, no awareness that anything unusual might be waiting beyond that fence. Maybe I've been wrong. Maybe what Jake and I experienced was an isolated incident, a group of people protecting privacy in their own strange way, and the cemetery itself was just an abandoned graveyard that locals still visited to tend family plots. Maybe the lights and the masks had been meant to scare off trespassers, and we'd simply been unlucky in our timing. Or maybe that woman was part of it. Maybe she was one of the people who'd surrounded us that evening, who'd operated those lights, who participated in whatever gatherings happened in that cleared space around the stone bench. Maybe her peaceful demeanor was the mask she wore during daylight hours, while something else emerged when the sun set and normal people stayed away. I still drive past those woods on my way to work. The route takes me along the main road that skirts the forest, and I can see the tree line where the cemetery sits hidden from casual view. The fence is still there, visible if you know where to look. The gaps in the chain link remain, probably widened further by time and weather and the occasional curious teenager looking for a thrill. I've never gone back. I never will. But sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I think about that man in the wolf mask, just sitting there between the graves, fingers tapping on stone, the monkey chained to the headstone beside him, both of them watching Jake and me with perfect stillness. I think about the lights that came on from all around us, the coordinated response, the way they herded us toward the fence and then stopped, letting us run, letting us escape. And I think about the photograph they sent 6 months later, the image of Jake and me standing at the edge of the clearing, captured from inside their circle. They'd let us take our fear and our questions home with us. They'd let us wonder and worry and slowly convince ourselves we'd imagined the worst of it. And then, just when we'd started to relax, they'd reminded us they remembered. I wonder sometimes if Jake thinks about it, if he still has nightmares, if he's built a better life in his new city, far from the woods and the cemetery and the memories. I wonder if the woman with the flowers visits every week or just on special occasions. I wonder how many others know about that place, how many are part of whatever happens there, how many have stood where Jake and I stood and been given the same choice, run and stay silent or stay and become something else. Last week, I saw something that brought it all back with terrible clarity. I was scrolling through social media before bed, that mindless activity you do when you're too tired to read but not quite ready to sleep. An algorithm somewhere decided to show me a post from a local news page, a missing person report, a college student who'd gone hiking in the state forest near my town and hadn't returned. The photo showed a young man, maybe 22, with an adventurous smile and hiking gear. The article said he'd told friends he was exploring abandoned locations for a photography project. It said his car was found parked near the entrance to an old logging road. It said search parties had combed the area but found no trace of him. And I knew, with terrible, absolute certainty, I knew where he'd gone. I knew what he'd found. I knew he'd been standing at the edge of a clearing, looking at something he didn't understand, when the lights came on and the choice was presented. Run or stay. Leave or join. Forget or remember. I didn't report what I knew, because what could I say? I had no proof, no evidence, just a memory and a fear and a photograph that existed in a deleted email account. I couldn't help that student. I couldn't warn others away without sounding insane. All I could do was add his face to the collection in my mind, the people who'd gotten too close to something that should have stayed hidden. The cemetery is still there. The people who use it are still there. And every October, when the light fades early and the shadows grow long, they're still sitting between the graves, fingers tapping on stone, waiting for the curious and the bold and the unlucky to push through the gaps in the fence and discover what should have stayed forgotten.